Everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and a day that, at least in my part of the world, is not raining. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the updated standards of care for outdoor dogs under the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act. My name is Tom Lewis, and I'm an industry relations specialist with Ontario Sheep Farmers. And with me also from Ontario Sheep is Anita O'Brien, no secret to most of you, who is our on-farm program lead. For the purpose of this webinar, we partnered with our friends at Ontario Federation of Agriculture and our friend Danny Glank from Ontario, it says Ontario Sheep, but from Ontario Federation of Agriculture is a farm policy analyst, and she will be helping to also facilitate the webinar and keep an eye on the chat. Presenting today is Tiffany Landau, Manager of Animal Welfare Policy Unit, and Nicole Rogers, Director of Community Safety and Animal Welfare Branch, both with the Strategic Policy Research and Innovation Division of the Ontario Ministry of the Solicitor General. So welcome everyone, and now I will turn it over to Danny, who will run through some housekeeping announcements before we begin.
Great, thanks Tom. So before we start, just wanted to take a quick moment. I know many of you have heard this over and over again with the amount of Zoom webinars that we attend, but just some quick housekeeping rules. So as you may have seen, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available for registrants after the meeting on OSF's YouTube channel. Please keep your microphone on mute for the duration of this presentation, and please keep your cameras off as well to preserve bandwidth for other attendees. If we do see cameras being turned on and microphones being turned on, we will turn them off. After the presentation, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions if we have time. Please use the raise hand button located at the bottom of your screen during the question period to ask your question. We ask that you please be patient and wait until your name is called before asking your question. You can also use the chat at any time to ask questions, which will be monitored by myself. If we run out of time to answer the majority of questions, we'll do our best to have them answered afterwards, and we'll email participants with those answers later on. On to you, Tom and Anita.
Perfect, thank you, Danny. And now I'm going to turn it over to either Tiffany or Nicole to kick off the presentation. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for having us here today. I'll just give you a quick overview about me and what I do at the Ministry of Solicitor General. So my name is Nicole Rogers, and I am the Acting Director of the Community Safety and Animal Welfare Policy Branch. Our branch is part of the Strategic Policy Research and Innovation Division of the Ministry of the Solicitor General. We focus on developing and updating legislation and regulations for the ministry, and in doing that, we work closely with our operational partners, such as Animal Welfare Services, in doing that work. Our branch specifically works on animal welfare, fire safety, and a number of other community safety related laws. And so for me, I've been working with this branch since 2018, and I've worked on a number of policy projects, including the development of the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act. I have been working for this Ministry of the Solicitor General since 2010. And with the Ontario Public Service and other ministries since 2003. So thank you very much for having me. Tiffany, did you want to do your quick bio now before I jump into the opening remarks?
Thanks, Nicole. I will do. And I'll go on video, but I'll turn it off after just because I find it keeps the connection working a bit better. But my name is Tiffany Landau, and I'm a manager, acting manager with the Animal Welfare Policy Unit in the Ministry of the Solicitor General. And as Nicole mentioned, we do focus on animal welfare policy development for the ministry. So that includes legislative, regulatory, and policy development. And I've been with this team since 2020 and with the ministry since 2015. So it's a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to present and answer some of your questions about the updated standards of care for outdoor dogs.
And I think I was not on video, so I hope I'm back on video now. Yeah, I'll just start us in with some kind of opening remarks to give some context about how we got here today. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today and provide some more information on the updates of the standards of care and administrative requirements regulation under the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act, or what we of course all refer to as the PAWS Act for outdoor dogs. As you may know, the PAWS Act came into force on January 1st, 2020, and it established a new legislative framework for animal welfare in Ontario. It also helped create a provincial government-based animal welfare enforcement body in Ontario, known as Animal Welfare Services. Animal Welfare Services is comprised of a team of provincial animal welfare inspectors that in legislation and a new enforcement model now in place. Over the past 2 years, the Ministry of and consulting on regulations under the PAWS Act to support animal welfare in Ontario. In November 2020, the ministry established a provincial animal welfare or PAWS advisory table to provide advice to the ministry on the development of regulations under the PAWS Act. This group was drawn from leading academics and experts, as well as organizations representing multiple sectors, including the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, representing the agricultural animal perspective, as well as animal advocacy, industry, sheltering, veterinary care, and enforcement. Based on input from that PAWS advisory table, public feedback, and enforcement insights, the ministry identified the need to update the standards of care that apply to dogs that live outdoors as a priority. Enforcement data and concerns expressed by members of the public and stakeholders had indicated that outdoor dogs face specific welfare and safety challenges. For example, an outdoor dog without any supervision can become injured or be attacked by a predator, become tangled in its tether, be exposed to extreme temperatures and rapid weather changes without an adequate shelter or shade, or have insufficient sources of water and heat in extreme cold. Dogs tethered outdoors for long periods of time without an opportunity for exercise and enrichment can also experience physical and psychological distress. The updated standards for outdoor dogs address these challenges and concerns in a proactive way with the goal of ensuring better animal welfare outcomes for outdoor dogs. The updates were also informed by multi-sector stakeholder feedback, including an outdoor dogs technical table established by the ministry with representation from Ontario Sheep, other representatives of various dog-related industries, veterinary science, enforcement entities, and other subject matter experts. We also considered jurisdictional reviews, academic literature, and other published information, including publications from veterinary, animal sheltering, and other expert associations. The updates set a clear definition for what constitutes a dog kept outdoors. Furthermore, the updates would require that owners and custodians meet more comprehensive requirements for these dogs, which my colleague will take you through shortly in the presentation. The updates also set limits on the long-term tethering of dogs outdoors. As you may already know, the requirements include specific exemptions related to livestock guardian dogs and the dogs that have access to a structure housing livestock, which will be discussed in further detail shortly. These updated standards will come into force on July 1st, 2022. The ministry is in the process of developing a guidance document that will help impacted owners understand the updated standards and set out additional best practices to assist in meeting those new requirements. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Tiffany, and she'll take you through the standards in detail. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Nicole. So I'm happy to take everyone through a summary of the standards today. And I just do want to mention that this is a summary and the full text of the regulation is available at the Ontario e-laws website. And so this summary document and this presentation is really intended to provide a high-level overview and is not intended to be legal advice. And we do encourage folks to take the time to read the full text of that regulation. As I said, that's available on the Ontario e-laws website. And as Nicole mentioned in her opening remarks, these updated standards of care for outdoor dogs will come into force on July 1st, 2022. So to kind of kick off the presentation, I want to start with the definition of what is an outdoor dog when we are talking about these updated standards. As you may know, the former OSPCA Act actually had standards of care for dogs that live primarily outdoors. And those standards were developed back in 2009. And then those standards were carried over from the OSPCA Act, the former OSPCA Act, to the now PAWS Act. But the ministry identified that, these standards would benefit from some updates, as Nicole mentioned, due to stakeholder and public feedback, feedback from our enforcement entity in terms of their insights from enforcement and experiences, to make sure that that outdoor dogs are getting right protections. And one of the challenges with the previous standards was really the definition of what is a dog who lives primarily outdoors. Really, there was a lot of vagueness around that, and it lacked clarity in terms of what constitutes living primarily outdoors, and how are we protecting those dogs that are left outdoors for extended periods of time unsupervised but may not live primarily outdoors. And so this resulted in an update under the updated standards that have been filed and that are coming into force on July 1st to provide a clearer definition of what is a dog kept outdoors. So the definition is really a dog kept outdoors is a dog that is outdoors for more than 60 minutes without its owner or custodian being physically present. And that means that's intended to refer to the owner being physically outside with the dog and providing that direct outdoor supervision. And so anytime that the standards reference kept outdoors, this means that the standard applies to a dog that falls under this definition as set out here. So with that kind of explanation around the definitional piece, I will take you through each of the specific standards that are outlined in the updates of the regulation. So first, we kind of have a grouping here around shade, shelter, and protection from the elements. So the standards require that a dog kept outdoors receive sufficient protection from the elements to prevent heat or cold related distress, and shade as required by the weather, including to protect from direct sunlight. I just want to mention here that the requirement around shade the intent around that is to recognize that shade is important in both the winter and the summer months. Of course, we know shade is important during the heat of the summer, but it's also important to note that dogs can experience sunburns and other skin issues from too much sunlight in the winter. And so there are benefits to having shade available in both the winter and the summer months, depending on those weather conditions, to make sure there is that protection from direct sunlight for the dog. In terms of additional standards, there is also a requirement for a dog shelter to be available to a dog kept outdoors at all times, otherwise known as a doghouse. For those familiar with the previous standards of care that apply to dogs that live primarily outdoors, those already required a weatherproofed and insulated, structurally sound enclosure of a size and design that was adequate and appropriate for the dog. And so these new requirements for a dog shelter just really aim to provide, again, more clarity and specificity as to what makes a good dog shelter for a dog kept outdoors, while also providing some flexibility for owners and custodians in certain areas, which I'll highlight as I go over the requirements. So a dog shelter must be waterproof and provide protection from the elements. So really a focus on protection from rain, as well as other elements like wind, snow, and sun. It must be structurally sound and free from features that may cause injury to the dog. For example, our inspectorate has seen dog houses with protruding screws and nails that might cause injury to the dog, or wire, or a dog house that is leaning or wobbling and may not be structurally sound and therefore appropriate for the dog's use. It must have an insulated roof, but flexibility is left to the owner or the custodian to determine the level of insulation that may be appropriate for their individual dog and the type of insulation that they would want to use to ensure that that roof is insulated. And it must be level, elevated, and have a dry floor, as well as be ensure that there's appropriate ventilation. It must also have a doorway that is free from obstructions. And here I just want to mention some examples might be, snowbank that is obstructing the dog from entering the doghouse, or debris or garbage outside of the doghouse. Really, the intent with this requirement is that the dog is not obstructed from entering the doghouse and can enter and exit comfortably. Something like a door flap, for example, is not considered to be an obstruction because the dog can still exit and enter the doghouse comfortably. And then finally, the dog shelter must have bedding that is at least 3 inches thick. But again, flexibility is provided to the owner or custodian to determine what type of bedding should be used. We know that some owners would prefer to use straw bedding, others use bedding such as wood shavings. So there is that flexibility depending on the preference of the individual dog and what might be appropriate for that dog. And that the bedding be changed as needed to stay clean, dry, comfortable, and unsoiled. Again, so there is flexibility for the owner on the exact frequency around changing the bedding, but really focusing on the key outcome of ensuring that that bedding stays, reasonably clean, dry, and comfortable, and reasonably unsoiled. So free from things like an accumulation of feces on the bedding, etc. And then when it comes to the size of a dog shelter, it must allow all dogs using it to turn around, lie down with their legs extended, and stand with their heads held at normal height. This is a fairly common requirement you'll see across many jurisdictions. It's very common in municipal bylaws in Ontario as well. And again, really the intent is to provide a little bit more specificity, going beyond just, that the size and design be adequate and appropriate for the dog, to really provide that specification around what the size of the dog shelter should be relative to the size of the dog, while also acknowledging that some owners do house multiple dogs in one dog shelter. And so ensuring that all dogs that are using the dog shelter are able to, again, turn around, lie down with their legs extended, and stand up with their heads at normal height so they can comfortably use the doghouse. Now, very important for our webinar today is to mention the exceptions that apply to this specific requirement for a dog shelter. So there are 2 exceptions that apply here. There is an exception that pertains to livestock guardian dogs, meaning that owners and custodians do not need to provide a dedicated dog shelter to livestock guardian dogs. And a livestock guardian dog is defined in the regulation as a dog that is identifiably of a breed that is generally recognized as suitable for the purposes of protection of livestock from predation, and a dog that lives with a flock or herd of livestock. And this is very important because we understand part of the rationale for a livestock guardian dog not requiring access to a dedicated dog shelter is because they do receive protection from the elements due to being housed with the flock or the herd and living with the flock or herd of livestock. And then the second exception is for dogs that have access to a structurally sound building that at the time is being used to house livestock. And this is intended to provide an exception where the dog has access to a building such as a barn that is actively being used to house livestock. And therefore, the barn would provide some warmth and protection to the dog because of the livestock that is housed there. And therefore, they do not need access to a dedicated dog shelter. Other than these exceptions for livestock guardian dogs and dogs that have access to a structurally sound building used to house livestock, other than those exceptions from the dog shelter requirement, the rest of these updated standards do continue to apply to livestock guardian dogs and to dogs that have access to a barn or other similar building. So the exception is limited to this dog shelter requirement. So moving on to food and water, there again is more specificity around requirements for food and water that must be provided to a dog kept outdoors. So food must meet the dog's daily caloric requirements, must be fit for consumption, not spoiled. For example, there have been instances where our inspectors have seen food that's been sitting out for some time and has started to sort of cook in the sun and is therefore no longer fit for consumption for a dog and might cause the dog to become sick. and does not contain contaminants, essentially. So dirt, feces, urine, or other toxic substances, again, that would make the food less palatable to the dog or less appropriate for the dog to consume. And then when it comes to water for a dog kept outdoors, water must be continuously available, so available at all times, and must not be frozen, and again, must not contain contaminants such as dirt, feces, urine, or other toxic substances that again would make the water not palatable to the dog or affect the dog's ability to drink that water, and must be replaced at least once every 24 hours to ensure that that water remains fresh. And food and water containers for a dog kept outdoors must be constructed to avoid injury and difficulty accessing food and water. So an example of that is, aiming to use a spill-proof container to make sure that there is ease of access to food and water, particularly water in that instance. Moving on to health and grooming. So there is a requirement for daily health and welfare checks of a dog kept outdoors. So this can include things like, for example, monitoring the dog's body condition and doing things like body condition scoring. The requirement itself, again, is not prescriptive on what the health and welfare check needs to look like. So there is flexibility to the owner there, but it requires a daily health and welfare check just to monitor the health status of an outdoor dog. There's also a requirement with respect to health for a dog kept outdoors that there must be isolation from other healthy dogs if the dog is either at high risk of or suffering from a contagious disease. And there are certain exceptions from this. So this does not apply if a veterinarian has advised in writing that compliance with this requirement is unnecessary. It also doesn't apply to puppies. They do not need to be isolated from their mother or substitute mother if they are less than 12 weeks old. And it also does not apply if the other dogs are already suffering from the same contagious disease or at high risk of the same contagious disease. Then of course the dog does not have to be prevented from having contact with objects used by those other dogs or those dogs because they've already been exposed to the contagious disease. And then finally, with respect to grooming, there is a requirement around grooming for a dog kept outdoors, just in recognition of, the kind of risks that may be posed by a dog being kept outdoors with respect to, matting of the coat or accumulation of ice or mud on the coat or the paws. So again, there's some flexibility here to the owner on the frequency of grooming, but the requirement is that grooming be provided as needed of the dog's nails and to avoid matting of the dog's coat or accumulation of ice or mud on its coat or under its paws. So if we go to the next slide, just scroll a bit down here. Thanks for that. So then we get into specific requirements that apply to tethering for a dog kept outdoors. And again, the previous standards of care that applied to dogs that live primarily outdoors did have very general requirements around tethering, specifying that a tether has to be, for example, 3 meters in length and allow the dog to move safely and unrestricted. So again, these requirements just expand on those requirements and aim to create more clarity and specificity to assist owners and custodians to come into compliance and to make sure that that tethers are being used safely on a dog kept outdoors. So tethers must permit 3 meters of horizontal movement. You might recall that the previous standard specified that a tether has to be 3 meters in length. And the reason for the change in language here is that we understand that depending on the way the dog is tethered, for example, if the dog is tethered to a very tall fixed object or a tall fence, that might limit the actual length of tether that the dog has available to them. So the intent with the requirement is to make sure that, not only is it a 3 meter tether, but really that the dog has to have that 3 meters of horizontal movement available to them to ensure that they have sufficient space when they are being kept on a tether outdoors. The tether must also allow the dog to move about safely, and it must be of a size, type, and weight that won't cause discomfort or injury to the dog. It must have a swivel at both ends, so that means at the collar end as well as at the end where the tether is attached to the fixed object. and it must be in good condition and well attached to prevent escape of the dog. And similarly, collars and harnesses that are used with a tether must be of a size, type, design, and fit that won't cause discomfort or injury. And again, our inspector has seen instances of, collars that are either of an improper type, design, or too tight of a fit and can cause very serious neck injuries to dogs and other significant issues. And so this is intended to mitigate those types of situations. And then finally, when tethering a dog outdoors, a dog kept outdoors, an owner or custodian must not use a choke, pinch, prong, slip, head halter, or martingale collar, again, because of the risks of these collars in terms of their ability to quickly tighten. These are just not appropriate to be used with a tether outdoors on a dog that is unsupervised because they can cause injury and in extreme cases, death of the dog. Additionally, tethering dogs that are under 6 months of age or that are in heat, whelping, or nursing is prohibited due to the specific risks that are faced in those circumstances. And then finally, tethering a dog kept outdoors must not cause undue distress, including because of the age, health, or reproductive status of the dog, or objects or hazards they can reach. So for example, in some cases, it may be inappropriate to tether a pregnant dog or a geriatric dog, depending on the circumstances of that individual dog and their tolerance to tethering and other factors. Or, it may be inappropriate to tether a dog close to certain objects or hazards, for example, tethering a dog on the edge of a deck or close to a fence, which could pose a strangulation risk. So really anything that could pose a risk of injury or strangulation to the dog would be prohibited in terms of the location of the tethering. Moving on to housing pens, there are also requirements that apply to a housing pen that is used for a dog outdoors. So a housing pen is defined as an enclosed yard, a caged area, a kennel, or an other outdoor enclosed area in which a dog is contained, and generally which is not large enough to provide sufficient space for the dog to kind of run at its top speed. And so really a housing pen here is intended to really refer to the dog's, kennel or yard area where it's being kept, not its kind of larger activity or exercise area, but more so the area where it's being contained or housed. And so when it comes to use of housing pens, again, that must not cause undue distress, and housing pens must be constructed to prevent escape and provide a reasonable protection from predators. For example, for example, a way of implementing this would be ensuring that, they're of an appropriate height, that the dog cannot jump the kennel fence or jump the yard fence, or that predators are not able to jump into the housing pen. Additionally, there are minimum size requirements for housing pens that are scaled to the height of the dog, measured at its shoulder. So you can see those in the chart on the right side here. Based on the height of the dog at its shoulder, there are minimum area requirements in meters squared. And when an additional dog is housed in the same pen, then 1.5 meters squared must be added for each additional dog housed in the same pen, again, to ensure that the pen size is scaled both to the size of the dog, but also the amount of dogs that are being housed there. And there is an exception that applies to this requirement for puppies essentially that are kept with their mother or substitute mother and are less than 12 weeks old. In that case, 1.5 additional square meters of space is not required for every additional puppy, as long as that puppy is under 12 weeks, as I mentioned, and is being kept with its mother or substitute mother. And then finally, with respect to housing pens, aggressive dogs must not be housed together, dogs that are exhibiting essentially aggression towards each other. And dogs that are in heat or coming into heat must not be housed with male dogs. And there is, again, an exception for this, where a female dog that is in heat or coming into heat may be placed in a housing pen with a male dog solely for the time required for them to mate, if the dogs are in the physical presence of the owner or custodian and one or more of the dogs, and that person is monitoring the safety of those dogs. And then finally, with respect to the housing pen and tether area, there are some requirements that apply to that that space. So it must provide enough space for natural behaviors, and there must be distinct areas available for feeding and drinking and defecating and urinating. And essentially, again, the intent with that is to make sure that the dog is not required to defecate and urinate in the same space where it is feeding and drinking, and there is that sufficient space for the dog when they're being contained. Dogs must also, dogs that are kept outdoors must also not be required or forced to stand, sit, or lie in their own feces, urine, mud, or water. So again, getting at the intent around, the space is sufficient and the space is cleaned in a manner that's sufficient to make sure that dogs are not required to be sitting, standing, or lying in their own feces, urine, or in mud and water for extended periods. And the area must be cleaned as needed to prevent the accumulation of waste, so the accumulation of feces and urine, and to keep that area sanitary and really to minimize parasites. So again, there is some flexibility here that is given to owners and custodians around the frequency of cleaning. There's no kind of set frequency that's specified, but the focus is really on the outcomes here to make sure that there is no accumulation of excrement, urine, or other waste that would pose a risk to the dog's health, to make sure that a sanitary environment is maintained and to really minimize the presence of parasites and ensure the health of the dog is sort of the critical outcomes here. And then finally, there are additional standards that apply to dogs that are tethered outdoors, essentially trying to, the intent there being to ensure that dogs that are tethered for extended periods are provided with sufficient daily exercise and enrichment to mitigate any potential negative impacts of long-term tethering. And so this requirement applies to any dog that is tethered outdoors for 23 hours in a 24-hour period, whether those 23 hours are consecutive or not, and whether the dog is supervised or not. And they must be taken off the tether for at least 60 continuous minutes to allow for exercise and enrichment. And again, there are certain exceptions to this. So this does not apply if the dog has, within the previous 24-hour period, participated in a racing event, hunting event, field trial event, or comparable event, and requires rest as a result of participating in that event. It also doesn't apply if extreme weather conditions identified by a weather warning or watch from Environment and Climate Change Canada, such as a heat warning, for example, would make it unsafe for the dog to exercise and receive enrichment, and therefore would make it unsafe for the dog to be taken off the tether. Or if a veterinarian advises in writing that the dog should not be taken off the tether for health reasons. And I also want to clarify, there's a question that's come up around this in the past as well, that in terms of meeting this requirement and taking the dog off the tether for 60 continuous minutes, the requirement does not require that the dog be left to run loose. To meet the requirement, an owner or custodian could let a dog into a larger activity pen where it's able to kind of run freely and get sufficient exercise for those 60 minutes, or could take the dog for a walk or run using a leash. And the regulation does clarify that a handheld leash is not a tether because it's not attached to a fixed object. And a handheld leash is generally used to walk or run a dog, and therefore provides the dog with greater mobility and allows them to access new scents, textures, and surroundings, and various forms of enrichment that being kept on a tether does not offer. So with that concludes the presentation portion of the session, and I'll turn it back over to Tom and folks to facilitate the Q&A portion.
Perfect, thank you. And I was just looking for my mute button here. And I'm just going to bring up one other thing. Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation, most informative. We'll take a few questions. As Danny mentioned before, if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, use the raise hand function and we will get to you. We have a number of questions that have come through the chat. So what we'll do is we'll likely start with a question out of the chat and then go to any live questions and go back and forth until we've completed those. So Danny, if you want to pull one of the questions from the chat to start, that would be great.
Sure. So I'm just going to start from the earliest question on. That question's from Lindsay. So Lindsay is asking, as they're reading this, they'll have to build some sort of portable doghouse to move paddock to paddock while grazing. Or is there a distance to the house that works? For example, one house on their 100-acre farm.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the regulation does not specify how close the doghouse needs to be to the dog, as long as that doghouse is accessible to the dog while they are being kept outdoors. That does suffice. And again, I'll mention again, there are those exceptions where if the dog is a livestock guardian dog, or the dog has access to a structurally sound building like a barn that's being used to house livestock, they don't require a dog shelter. But in the cases where they do require a dog shelter, there's no distance specified in the regulation. So one house on, a 100-acre farm would suffice as long as the dog has ready access to that doghouse.
Great, thanks. I see that Lindsay has their hand up. So I'm gonna allow them to unmute themselves. And it might be a clarification to that question or a whole new question. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Thank you. Yeah, just a clarification, because I think for our home farm, I think I understand the requirements fully. So our situation is somewhat unique in that we graze solar installations away from our home farm. And the guardian dogs are integral to being able to do that, as they provide coyote control, protection from coyotes for our sheep and lambs. But it does complicate this somewhat in that, of course, we are off-site, we are on 100-acre or 200-acre pieces of property, and we move our sheep daily. So in the spirit of this regulation, because I think everything else is very much, I think it's great, I think it's a positive step. We can meet all our dogs' needs, absolutely, except for they always have shade, they always have water. They're always checked on within that 24-hour period, sometimes several times. But the biggest issue for us is going to meet this housing requirement, in that we are on potentially properties that have 0 buildings. So do we have to have an appropriate doghouse per site that the dogs can access? And the follow-up would be, we may have 2 to 4 dogs per 100 acres. Do they each need one, or just one that each of them can fit in at any time?
Yeah, can you clarify, are your dogs livestock guardian dogs, or they're not?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, they live with the sheep 24/7.
Okay, so
yeah.
So if they are livestock guardian dogs, then the requirement for the dog shelter, like a dedicated dog shelter in the regulation, does not apply to livestock guardian dogs, because we do recognize that livestock guardian dogs do get protection from the elements and sheltered by living with the flock. So this requirement for the dog shelter that meets these set specifications around being waterproof, insulated roof, etc., that doesn't apply in the case of livestock guardian dogs.
So that's not entirely clear from that, because to reiterate, we're off-site, we're not at our farm, and the sites that we're on, they're either 100 or 200 acres, and they do not have barns on them either. So our dogs live with the sheep. We've been doing this is our 5th full season. They are under the panels. They do have access to shelter under the cart that moves paddock to paddock, but based on the PDF that I've been looking at, because I've been trying to read it, the exemption, I understand the exemption when we're at home, in that we have barns that they have access to 24/7. But when we are off-site, I want to make sure that, no one's going to be calling in and saying, these dogs don't have an appropriate doghouse. So I need to fully understand whether or not we need to build some sort of mobile doghouse per site, because I want to make sure we are well within these rules, because we farm in the public eye, and this is incredibly important.
Tiffany, can I jump in here? It's Anita.
Yeah.
So Lindsay, there's 2 exemptions. One is for livestock guardian dogs that are actively working on pasture or with their flock or herd. And the other exemption is for dogs that have access to a livestock facility. Okay, think of them as 2 exemptions, not one.
Okay.
Does that make it
correct.
clearer?
That's what I was going to clarify as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then we're fine. So and just to add, because if anyone else is worried or thinking about this, we've added a dog care kit to each of our solar site locations so that there's a dog brush. We, of course, they have water because the sheep have to have water. They're checked on at least once a day, usually more than that, and we usually spend several hours with them each day. So I'm just ticking off the boxes and making sure that we fully understand these rules, so that I guess the key for me is the public understanding these rules and also bylaw understanding these rules. We have developed a pretty good relationship with bylaw in the one area that we solar graze, so that they fully understand what our dogs are doing and how they're cared for. But to me, we want to make sure we're following the rules, but we also want to make sure that the rules are properly communicated so that we're not dealing with bylaw showing up every day or every week with a new complaint. So I'd love to hear at some point later what the communication strategy is on this outward, for sure.
Yeah, and let me quickly address that as well, Lindsay, because thank you for raising that. And thanks for your diligence and wanting to, come into compliance with the updated standards. We really appreciate you raising that and asking. In terms of who is responsible for enforcing the updated standards, so the responsibility does fall with the province's animal welfare enforcement body. So that's Animal Welfare Services, who took over the carriage of enforcement from the OSPCA. So municipal bylaw would not be responsible for enforcing these standards. Now, I understand it's still important that they have awareness of the new standards, and I can confirm that the ministry did distribute communications on these updated standards to the Association of Municipalities of Ontario and to all 444 municipalities. And this fact sheet and these FAQs were also sent out to those municipalities. But just to clarify for everyone, the responsibility for enforcement does fall with Provincial Animal Welfare Services, AWS, and it does not fall with municipal bylaw.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Lindsay, for the question. I'm going to go over to Jacob, who's been waiting patiently with his hand up. So Jacob, I've unmuted you. You should be able to go ahead.
Hi, so with the water bowl specification saying unfrozen water, I live in Northern Ontario where we get temperatures going down to -50. I've checked every water bowl heater available and the maximum spec I found is -25. So I don't understand how you're not asking me to do something impossible. Like, I understand it'd be possible in Toronto, Ottawa area, that kind of thing, Southern Ontario, but I mean, there's a lot more to the province than just the south. So how do we do this in the north?
Yeah, I appreciate that feedback, and I definitely think as part of our, consultations and the public feedback that we heard through the Ontario Regulatory Registry, we really did hear that continuous access to clean fresh water is vital to make sure that outdoor dogs have good health and vitality, and that it's not just about preventing the extreme result of dehydration, but making sure that dogs have continuous access to water,
But
to avoid them from getting to that state.
Currently, so what we do is we give baited water multiple times a day to make sure that the dogs have adequate hydration, which actually makes a lot more sense because you can put fresh water out, but if the dogs don't drink it, it's not doing much, right? So I mean, my dogs get checked multiple times a year by veterinaries. I've never had an issue with dehydration. This has been the way it's been done for over 100 years in my area to hydrate dogs in the winter. So I don't understand how you can now ask me to do it in a way that's literally impossible with current technology.
I appreciate that feedback. I mean, I think we have heard that this is done in other contexts. It's done in the agricultural context, in terms of providing continuous access to water, even in the winter months. And we understand there's various technologies that are used, corded heated water bowls, rechargeable cordless bowls, de-icers and tank heaters, solar bowls, etc. But we really are focused on ensuring the health and vitality of outdoor dogs. And, lack of access to unfrozen water in the winter months is something that has come up as an enforcement issue and has come up you know, in court cases, it's come up a number of times as something that's been a welfare issue for outdoor dogs, and something that came up very strongly in public feedback as well, to make sure that that outdoor dogs have that continuous access. So I think it's a matter of looking at the various tools available and perhaps learning from other contexts like the agricultural context on what the best practices are there.
Great, thanks for that, Tiffany. Appreciate that information. I have another question in the chat. So Leah is just looking for a little bit of clarification. What if a dog is in a kennel system that has access to an indoor area and is outdoors by choice, but can go in at any time? Any insight?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think in terms of the application of the regulation, it does apply to any dog that is outdoors for more than 60 continuous minutes without its owner or custodian physically present. So I think, you know, if the dog is choosing to access an outdoor area but is not outdoors for those 60 continuous minutes because it's popping indoors and going back outdoors, you know, that may not meet the definition of a dog kept outdoors, and therefore these standards may not apply. It would be, you know, dependent on a case-by-case basis, I think, in that instance. But that is how the definition applies. It applies to any dog that is outdoors for more than 60 continuous minutes without its owner or custodian physically present.
Great, thank you, Leah. I hope that provides a little bit of clarification in your question. I have another one. Just looking for the definition of indoors. Is it any building? Is there size specifications, insulated, heated, temperature? I know you touched on some of those, but maybe just a quick reminder.
Yeah, so the regulation itself does not provide a definition of indoors. I think that, you know, with respect to certain exceptions or exemptions, like a dog having access to a structurally sound building that is used to house livestock, you know, that provides some specification as to an indoor space that would be considered an appropriate shelter. In the absence of that, you know, the intent with the requirements around a dog shelter is to make sure that there is that appropriate protection from the elements, so insulated roof, etc. But as I said, the regulation doesn't provide a definition of, you know, indoors versus outdoors. It does apply to a dog that is outdoors for more than 60 continuous minutes without the owner or custodian being physically present.
Great, thanks. Is there a requirement that each dog have a doghouse, or is it one doghouse that would be suitable for each dog? So Lindsay has some dogs, again, that are on pasture, so not necessarily under the exemption.
Right, that's a great question. And no, the regulation does not require that each dog kept outdoors have its own individual doghouse. It simply requires that any dog that is kept outdoors have access to a dog shelter or doghouse, but that dog shelter can be shared by multiple dogs as long as it meets the requirements of the regulation. So for example, as long as it's of a size and design that permits all of the dogs that are regularly using that shelter to turn around, lie down with their legs extended, and stand with their heads held at normal height. But there's no requirement for essentially one doghouse per dog, if that helps clarify.
That's great, thank you. Is there no shade requirement in housing pens in the regulation?
So that's a great question. That's just the way the regulation is structured. The shade requirement applies generally to any dog that is kept outdoors for more than 60 continuous minutes without its owner or custodian present. So that doesn't matter if the dog is kept on a tether or a housing pen, or, you know, using another method. The shade requirement applies to all of those circumstances because it applies anytime a dog is, again, kept outdoors for more than those 60 continuous minutes unsupervised. So it would apply when the dog is in a housing pen.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it. Margaret has a good question. How is undue distress defined? That's a great question. I'll start with just giving everyone the definition of distress from the PAWS Act itself, because I know not everyone may be familiar with that specific definition.
So in So distress as defined under the PAWS Act means the state of being in need of proper care, water, food, or shelter, injured, sick, in pain or suffering, or abused or subject to undue psychological or physical hardship, privation, or neglect. Now, when it comes to determining whether it's undue distress, you know, just like determining whether a dog is in distress as meets the definition under the Act, it will be on a case-by-case basis because it is different depending on the individual dog. You know, I think that there would be likely a dialogue between the inspectorate and owners about that individual dog, you know, as there often is when there is any kind of enforcement action. But, you know, it depends on factors like the dog's tolerance toward tethering, or, you know, can depend on other factors like we mentioned around their age or their health status or their reproductive status. And so there is no, you know, kind of one definition of what would be undue distress for any particular dog, because it would depend on those circumstances that would be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Great. Jacob had another just clarification question. Why is the housing pen size 107 square feet when the majority of manufacturers sell 100 square foot pens? I don't know if you have any information on the technicality of that detail.
Yeah, so what I can share on that is that the housing pen size, which as we mentioned is a scaled approach based on the height of the dog measured at their shoulder, that is based on the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association Code of Practice for Kennel Operations. They do set out standards for the size of a kind of a primary enclosure for a dog. And so that CVMA kennel code is considered to be a best practice that has been adopted by a number of other jurisdictions. You know, in some cases, it's actually been adopted into their regulation directly. And so that's why that approach was taken, was to align with kind of a national best practice that's been endorsed by the CVMA.
Great, appreciate that, Tiffany. I see that Jason has his hand up. Jason, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. Although I'm a cattle farmer, I do use guardian dogs because I'm in coyote country. And my dogs are not with the cattle full time. They are free to go under gates and come in and out. But you talk about keeping them safe from predation. Guardian dogs were designed and bred for centuries now to deal with predators. It is not physically possible for me to keep them safe from predators. That's how they were bred, to deal with predators if they become a nuisance. And my dogs need to roam the full 200 acres, and by putting their scent down, that's what keeps predators at bay, and it has worked for me for 16 years now. So I would hate to think that somebody thinks my dog is out on the loose all the time on my property and cannot be kept safe from predators. It's not physically possible. They attack predators. And then secondly, just for your pen size, I just want to clarify that most people in residential neighborhoods have the 10 by 10 pens, which is that size, and I can understand how you came by that size, but then the dog needs shelter, so the pen size would actually be short by substantial amount in square footage. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on too long.
Not at all. So just on the first piece around protection from predatory animals, so I do want to clarify that that specifically applies where a dog is being kept outdoors in a housing pen. So essentially like a kennel or like a specific fenced in yard that's being used for containment. So if it's a livestock guardian dog that's essentially roaming the property and is not being kept in a housing pen, then it may be that requirement, you know, doesn't specifically apply, because really the intent behind that was really that, you know, if a dog is in a kennel and unable to escape, you don't want the kennel to, for example, have such short walls that you've got predators jumping into that kennel, attacking the dog, etc. So that was really the intent. And the regulation also refers to providing reasonable protection from predatory animals, because we do understand that, it's not entirely possible to completely prevent predators from coming around or potentially coming into contact with outdoor dogs. But what is that reasonable protection? And then the second piece around the pen, just to clarify, the size of the housing pen pertains to the size of the pen itself, not the area of square footage that has to be available to the dog. So if the dog is in a 4 square meter pen, if it's 20 centimeter dog in height, and the doghouse is within that pen, that doesn't subtract from the size of the pen. The pen itself is still 4 square meters, if that helps. I know that people use different configurations. So some people have the doghouse attached to the pen from the outside. Some people put the doghouse inside. The requirement is intended to just refer to the size of the pen itself. And if the doghouse takes away from the square footage, that's not a problem, because it's about the pen being that size. Does that help clarify?
So just, yes, thank you. And thanks for the clarity. And I apologize to all my fellow producers out there, and in this case, sheep producers. The breeding is fantastic, and I get my dogs from a sheep producer. But you've used the word intent multiple times now. And I apologize, and I don't want to seem rude in any way, shape, or form, but intent is not in writing, and it can be difficult in some situations where we're in a I don't want to call it a confrontation, but in a discussion, and perception gets involved, and then application of the rules, So I would just ask that maybe some documentation be provided for all of the producers that use livestock guardian dogs.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. And of course, anytime a new piece of legislation or regulations are put into place, there is always a learning curve, and there is an interpretation piece, as you've mentioned. And I will take this opportunity to mention that there will be training for provincial animal welfare inspectors on the new requirements. And so, that will aim to provide some of that consistency and understanding as well. But again, I appreciate your comment there that, there will always be differences in interpretation. That's something that comes with new rules coming into effect and people sort of gaining understanding. And so we can, explore any opportunities to make.
Perfect. And I see we have one more question, Danny, in the chat, and maybe see if there's one extra live one that we want to take, just given that we have come up to the 1 hour mark.
Sure. So I'm just going to ask one more, and again, I'm just going in timely order. Margaret was just looking for a little bit of clarification as to what does extended legs mean. Does it mean both front and back with the dog on its side, or from front to back?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite understand the difference there in the comment.
Margaret, I'm not sure if you're on, if you'd like to add a little bit of clarity to that question.
Yes, just in determining the size of the doghouse, what does that mean in regards to, like, if they're laying on their side, their legs can go out extended in that direction, or some dogs lay with them out front and back. And if they have long legs, it can be quite long. So
yeah, I mean, I think the intent around the requirement is to make sure that the dog can, sit and lie down and turn around comfortably in the doghouse. So, I mean, that to some extent that may be dependent, as you said, on how the dog usually lies down, what their usual posture is when they're doing so. But that's really the intent around this type of requirement. And when it's put in place in other jurisdictions as well, it's to make sure that the dog can essentially lie down comfortably without, being constricted or touching the doghouse, or not, having sufficient space to lie down comfortably.
okay, so they can sleep in a curled up type situation then, if they can get
Exactly.
into that position.
Exactly. I would say, you know, that's part of definitely the intent around the requirement to make sure that they can comfortably use the doghouse. They can sleep, they can sit, they can rest, because that's the intent of providing the dog shelter.
Right. If there's a door, they can extend their legs out that way too.
That's a possibility as well if there's no door covering blocking.
Okay.
Perfect, and thank you, Margaret, for the question. I'll just do a last call on one last live question, if anyone has one, seeing as there were none others in the chat. And I'll just give that another moment or two to see if we have anyone else. Oh, I saw a hand go up quick and then down.
Tom, it's Sheila Finn. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can. Sheila, go ahead if you have a question, and
Yeah,
we'll have you be the last live question today. So go ahead.
Yes. Well, first, the presentation was excellent. Second, it was very timely down in our region because there's been quite a bit of discussions about the issue. My question is, we have within our sheep association a policy where if for some reason some neighbor complains that you're not doing the rules and regulations as outlined in our presentation today, that I can turn to my sheep association and they will assist me, as they have done in the past, with my local director partaking in the meetings, so we have support and backup regarding the rules, or do we call in our vets that are our vet of records? And I did see somebody asked a question about what are our steps we have to do when we've done all the rules to ensure that we are not unfairly charged because of bad neighbors or neighbors that think we're bad people.
Good question,
Thank you.
Sheila.
Sounds like that might be one for Ontario Sheep.
Yeah, happy to jump in from an Ontario sheep perspective.
Or is that one that's more direct?
Well, I can certainly answer from an Ontario sheep perspective. We are happy to assist any registered producer who may be having an issue with either an animal welfare issue or complaint that may or may not be legitimate or completely accurate. So Sheila, yes, and same would be if there's any issue involving livestock guardian dogs where support for a registered producer is needed. But I think there was also a question, part of Sheila's from the ministry's perspective, in how do we ensure that those things don't continue to happen, or are there checks and balances if repeated complaints keep coming in almost from a nuisance perspective to a producer? How does the ministry look at that or handle those situations? I think is part of the question I took from.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. You've said it much better than I.
It's that second cup of coffee.
So I might need to take part of that back because part of that is kind of more of an operational question. And
yeah,
I was just
more to suggest that. Sorry. Why don't I'll continue on. We were just going to say that probably is a better question for our operational colleagues at Animal Welfare Services. I know that they would deal with these types of situations every once in a while. You know, they'll of course be, you know, if they are responding to a complaint, they'll of course give a fair assessment to when they come to their inspection or investigation. But if there are kind of, you know, those repeated nuisance things of a you know, entity or a person that they have gone before and seen that there haven't been problems, I'm not sure if they have a process for that. But it is something we can, you know, possibly follow up on with a response afterward.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. That would be most appreciated. And I know it is an issue that is ongoing for a number of our producers in certain areas of the province. So that being said, everyone, it is now 9 minutes after 1. And just to respect both our presenters' time and everyone else who took the time out of their day to join us, thank you. Thank you, Tiffany and Nicole, for joining us as well and providing the information that you have, and Anita and Danny for assisting with hosting this event. We hope that it was informative to you, the listeners. It will be posted on the OSF YouTube channel in the next few days. As well, I have included in the link the OSF resource page, where we will be putting the handouts from today's presentation that were also shared. And we will continue to keep that page updated as time goes on. And very much appreciate everyone for taking part in today's event. I don't know, Danny, if you have anything from an OFA perspective, or Anita, if you have anything else you wanted to mention, but feel free to jump in now.
No, I just want to thank everybody for their time and the presenters from Solgen, and thank you OSF for hosting. There was just a last question. So there were a couple unanswered questions left in the chat, and we'll do our best to get those answers and get them out to you in a timely manner.
Perfect. Thank you, Danny. And that being said, everyone, thank you for joining us, and have a safe drive home.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.